Galaxy leggings, flower crowns, creepers, American Apparel hoodies. If any of these images just triggered an instant wave of nostalgia for you, then congratulations, you survived peak Tumblr. But Tumblr wasn't just an era, it was a seismic shift in fashion. From 2010 to 2014, Tumblr was fashion's playground. Aesthetics like soft grunge, indie sleaze, and pastel goth. None of these were from runways, they were bedroom inventions. So why does it matter now? The Tumblr era changed how a whole generation thinks and feels about fashion. And it shaped how brands communicate, how trends emerge, and how we express ourselves online. So today we're deep diving into Tumblr's chaotic legacy, why it exploded, why it died, and how it still haunts us. So let's get into it. If you're either too old or you're too young and you missed it, the Tumblr aesthetic was all about styles that weren't on runways. They were scattered across pixelated mood boards. Styles like soft grunge with flannels and ripped tights, indie sleaze with messy eyeliner and vintage band tees worn ironically, pastel goth with pink hair, skeleton hands, and chokers. But Tumblr fashion was more than the clothes or the pieces. It was about mood. You know, the grainy, self-styled photography. It was raw and it was real and it was curated chaotically. And one thing that attributed to this chaotic curation was the idea of reblogging. So Tumblr had this very unique feature called reblogging. I know on Instagram you can repost something, but usually you would be reposting something that's relevant to you or something that you're in some way. But Tumblr, you would just reblog whatever you happened to like. At first glance, it does seem like just another form of sharing, but on Tumblr, it was more like a form of personal curation. Like reblogging wasn't passive, it was consciously crafting your page's identity. And through this, Tumblr feeds became like living mood boards, editing your small piece of digital real estate to match your internal feelings and your aspirations. And fashion wasn't about what you actually wear in real life, it was about what your online presence says about you. So this, as a concept, changed fashion consumption. On Tumblr, you didn't style outfits, you styled your feed and your page. And it allowed you to build kind of an aesthetic universe of your own, with clothing, photography, poetry, and music. And through this, Tumblr kind of trained a generation to view personal styles and identities as something that was constantly in motion, editable, adaptable, and fine to be under construction. In today's landscape, we understand personal branding as aesthetic becoming identity. And I personally feel this can really be traced back to Tumblr's culture of reblogging. And the whole thing was fueled by certain brands and personalities that became synonymous with the platform's style. At the top of that list, as we've mentioned, is American Apparel, Tumblr's unofficial uniform. You know, they had super provocative ads to accompany their minimal basics. It was really the marketing that did it more than anything else, and it was at a time when the internet was kind of going through growing pains, you know. So we just saw the ads and we were like, whoa, that looks good, and then we bought it. But along with American Apparel, fast fashion brands like Urban Outfitters and Topshop tapped into Tumblr's moody, vintage-inspired aesthetic. But along with the iconic brands of Tumblr, Tumblr also had iconic people. Sky Ferreira, very much one of them. You know, she had the bleached hair and the smudged eyeliner, and she really kind of embodied that indie sleaze thing. Effie from Skins was huge on there, giving soft grunge. Photographers like the Cobra Snake captured these kind of gritty nightlife scenes that spread across people's dashboards. Not to mention Terry Richardson. Unfortunately, yeah, that was also a thing. Tavi Gevinson and Rookie Mag were big for the teenage girls, not so much my side of Tumblr. But she did this kind of thing of combining fashion with feminism and art and identity that in hindsight was quite iconic. This was before influencers, and this era kind of birthed the micro celebrity. But there was no way to monetize that, so they were just big on Tumblr and still working at whatever job they had, that was it. And it was cool, like normal teenagers could become style icons, and they really kind of paved the way so influencers could emerge over the next decade. And what this ultimately did was start to shift the balance of power in fashion, from runways and editors to bedroom mirror selfies. And these bedroom mirror selfies gave rise to the Tumblr girl archetype. You know, Tumblr had a ton of different archetypes, but none more prominent than the Tumblr girl. And she's iconic, she's moody, she's mysterious, more of like a character than an aesthetic, if you know what I mean. You know, she's smoking a cigarette, she's got Arctic Monkeys lyrics in her bio, sad eyes, smudged eyeliner, etc., etc. She was really the physical embodiment of teenage angst, like equal parts aspiration and melancholy. You know, you can see like a grainy photo of a Tumblr girl looking out a window wearing a kind of oversized sweater, or a lot of photos at late night parties, and oh yeah, also listening to Lana Del Rey all the time. And the Tumblr girl evolved into numerous things that we can see in fashion today. I feel like a lot of the early kind of Instagram influencers adapted this kind of detached coolness and feed curation that came from the Tumblr girl. And her kind of emotional complexity and aesthetics were resurrected in Euphoria for Gen Z. You can also see a lot of her aesthetics in TikTok trends like the VSCO girls or the clean girls, downtown girls. They all trace their roots back to the Tumblr girl. Basically, she was kind of a blueprint, and it reminds us how much Tumblr shaped our modern ideas of online self-expression. But by far, Tumblr's biggest legacy is mood boarding. I don't think Tumblr invented mood boards. Surely mood boards existed before that, but Tumblr did teach an entire generation how to communicate visually. You know, we've all learned from Tumblr how to curate an aesthetic through photos and colors and styles. And today's Pinterest and Instagram thrive off this exact principle. Another huge lasting impact of Tumblr is the e-girls and the e-boys that are all over TikTok are direct descendants of Tumblr's alt-core aesthetic. You know, the heavy makeup, the colored hair, the oversized tees. This kind of culture on TikTok to me feels like Tumblr reincarnated. And you can also see a lot of Tumblr's influence in brands. You know, Heaven by Marc Jacobs and Balenciaga are using these kind of grainy visuals, ironic slogans, and very intentionally messy styling to connect with us, like a generation that grew up scrolling dashboards. I think for a lot of users, Tumblr was a refuge. For teens who felt misunderstood at home or at school or just in life, they could kind of find a sense of belonging in Tumblr's endless scroll. In hindsight, it was a lifeline for LGBT youth and neurodivergent teens, and anyone who was just a bit weird and didn't fit into mainstream culture. And the main reason for this is that unlike other platforms at the time, Tumblr offered anonymity. I mean, you could put your name and face on there if you wanted to, or you could not. You weren't searchable like you are on Instagram. And through that, users could really safely explore their identities without the kind of fear of the world watching them. You know, on Tumblr, you saw a lot of experimenting with gender expression and sexuality and personal style away from prying eyes of the other kids at school or your parents or like whoever. Tumblr really became a tool for self-discovery, allowing young people to be who they were or who they were aspiring to be. But this emotional openness of Tumblr definitely had a dark side. As aesthetic communities emerged, so did ones that focused on loneliness and self-destructive behavior. You know, Sad Girl Tumblr very much romanticized mental illness and isolation, but often kind of in a toxic way that went unchecked because as teenagers and at that time, we didn't have the context or the language to address these kind of things in a healthy way. You know, I remember seeing a lot of images of bruised knees and teary cheeks, a lot of captions about loneliness and isolation, but were probably quite confronting. And on top of that, Tumblr would often glamorize harmful ideas surrounding body image. You know, the image of thinness on Tumblr, I'm sure added fuel to the fire for people that were suffering from eating disorders. Not to mention, and you know, I can't speak for Tumblr's user base because I don't know, but at least Tumblr's icons were certainly not diverse to say the least. I mean, look at them, they're definitely one type of person. And again, this went unchecked because I guess we didn't have the language or the knowledge to recognize this and address it. So in hindsight, the ignorance of Tumblr does feel a bit cringe at this point. But who knows, maybe I was only on one side of Tumblr and maybe the side of Tumblr that you were on was different. So if that's the case, let's talk about it in the comments. But it is important to talk about this when reflecting on the Tumblr era. Like, it was really messy, but it also did reveal fashion's kind of emotional power. You know, clothes can be identity and armor and comfort, but they can also reinforce and romanticize destructive and negative ideas. And in certain circumstances can isolate an important part of our community. And understanding and reflecting on Tumblr's kind of dual legacy helps us to navigate today's digital culture. It reminds us that fashion is not service level. It's intertwined with our emotional lives and our identities for better or for worse. So in the end, what happened? Like everything, Tumblr's golden age eventually had to end. And the decline really began with Yahoo's acquisition of the platform in 2013. In an attempt to monetize and sanitize the platform, Tumblr implemented strict bans on NSFW content. Oh yeah, I didn't mention that. Tumblr was full of corn. Like, so much. And, you know, I guess it's just like the internet in general, so many sexually frustrated people in one place, it was bound to happen. But they didn't just remove the explicit images, they inadvertently kind of gutted the rebellious, expressive nature that made Tumblr thrive in the first place. I mean, of course, NSFW images weren't the core of Tumblr, but I guess that kind of thing is symbolic of the freedom that the platform allowed for people. And without that freedom, the platform was no longer appealing. Meanwhile, Instagram was rising massively with a new type of platform. It was sleek and polished and available on your phone. Well, in the beginning, I believe was only on phones. iPhones were still newish at the time, and Tumblr was used by the majority of people on the computer. So Instagram provided these carefully curated grids that were available on the go with you, which replaced the chaotic dashboards of Tumblr. Over time, influencers would come to replace the blurry selfies, and if Tumblr was about authenticity, Instagram was very much about aspiration, which still reigns supreme today. But also, on top of that, Tumblr's generation was simply growing up. The kids who reblogged Effie's eyeliner went on to be the next generation of creatives and designers and stuff. A lot of people, including myself, took Tumblr's kind of DIY ethos and went on to apply it to their professional lives and brought those aesthetics and those skills that they had learned and applied it to mainstream fashion spaces. And the final nail in the coffin was a critical culture shift. Anonymity went out of fashion and was replaced with personal branding. You know, Tumblr thrived because it allowed experimentation under pseudonyms. On Tumblr, it was like your online persona didn't have to match your reality. You could be a high school student in reality and be a completely different thing on the internet, which really was part of the appeal. But when Instagram took over, it kind of demanded that you make your life public and also perfectly polished, which ultimately ended up killing Tumblr's brand of chaos. But it still matters. Tumblr's golden years feel very distant at this point. Like if a baby was born when I was on Tumblr, it would be in high school by now. But Tumblr still has its fingerprints all over today's fashion landscape. You know, we spoke before about Balenciaga and Heaven by Marc Jacobs, but also Miu Miu's kind of gritty but girly aesthetic all draw very heavily from Tumblr's DIY sensibility. And also consider like what we're seeing in street style these days. Indie sleaze, emo nostalgia, and we're still seeing the ever-enduring alt girl. These things obviously aren't new. They're recycled from Tumblr's viral moments and kind of an homage to the emotion that Tumblr gave us permission to embrace. Even fashion's current obsession with, you know, curated chaos and deliberately low-res images, all these kind of blurry campaign photos and messy styling, it all is echoing Tumblr's legacy to me. Our current world is hyper-polished and very algorithm-driven. And I think people are seeing this kind of return to Tumblr's style as a way to reclaim some sort of realness. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, I feel like for a lot of us, Tumblr taught us how to be online. It was raw, it was emotional, it was messy. You know, to remember it is kind of cringe, but kind of fun. So what do you think? What was your experience like on Tumblr? Was it completely different to mine? Give me your take. Tell me what you think in the comments. Like and subscribe.